Hello and welcome to Cognitive Drift. A lot of people seem to get tripped up by the word atheism. They hear it and think it means something it doesn't. They assume it's just another worldview, another set of beliefs, just like religion, only flipped upside down. But that's not really how it works. Atheism, in the simplest possible sense, just means the absence of belief in gods. That's it. There's no holy book, no prophets, no dogma, no required rituals, no commandments, no mandatory ideology. And yet, people still ask questions like, well, what do atheists believe in then? Or, isn't atheism just another faith? Those questions sound reasonable at first, until you realize they're built on a kind of false equivalence, like saying not collecting stamps is a hobby, or that bald is a type of hairstyle. It only makes sense if you've already accepted the religious framing as the default, but once you step outside of that framing, the illusion starts to crack. Part of the confusion comes from how deeply belief is baked into our language. We live in a world where religious belief is treated like a moral baseline. It's considered polite, respectable, even virtuous to say you believe. It doesn't matter much what you believe as long as you believe in something, but the moment you say you don't believe in gods, in heaven, in divine plans, suddenly that gets treated like a claim in itself. But a lack of belief isn't the same as a belief. Saying, I don't believe there's a God, isn't the same as saying, I believe there is no God. There's a subtle but important difference. The first is a rejection of a claim. The second is a claim of its own. Atheism, in its core form, doesn't require you to assert anything. It just says, I haven't been given enough reason to believe. That's why it's not a belief system. It's the absence of a belief system. It doesn't tell you what to think about morality or politics or the meaning of life. It doesn't offer answers. It just questions whether certain answers were ever justified in the first place. And yet, people keep trying to paint atheism as some kind of ideology. Some say it's a rejection of all spirituality, or that it's inherently materialistic, or nihilistic, or even anti-human. Some claim it's part of some larger movement or agenda or philosophy. But that's like blaming someone for the side effects of silence, or accusing someone of being anti-gang langlet just because they're quiet. If atheism leads people to develop other frameworks, humanism, rationalism, skepticism, naturalism, that's a separate step. Those are ideas people explore after they've already stepped away from religious belief, not because atheism demands it, but because religion no longer fills the gap. There's also this habit of trying to stick labels on people who don't believe, like there must be a box to put them in. What do you stand for then? What do you live by? But asking that is like handing someone an empty plate and demanding to know what kind of meal they've just cooked. It's a misunderstanding of the starting point. Most people aren't atheists because they're trying to rebel against something, or because they want to follow a trend, or because they think it's edgy. It usually comes from a process, often a long, quiet one, of realizing that the reasons they were given to believe simply weren't enough. And this isn't about being certain that gods don't exist either. That's another misunderstanding. You don't need to be certain to withhold belief. You just need to see that the burden of proof hasn't been met. That's how we treat almost everything else in life. If someone tells you they saw a dragon in their garage, and they can't show it to you, and the footprints keep vanishing, and the heat signature doesn't register, and the roar can't be recorded, do you start believing in invisible dragons? Or do you say, I'll wait for some actual evidence? That's not dogma. That's basic reasoning. It doesn't mean you've created a new belief system called dragon disbelief. It just means you're applying the same standards you'd apply to any other extraordinary claim. And yet, when it comes to gods, people often treat skepticism as if it's an aggressive stance, as if not being convinced is the same as making a hostile claim. But skepticism isn't hostility, it's caution. It's holding back your agreement until the evidence earns it. Some people say, well, you can't prove God doesn't exist. But that's not how belief usually works. We don't demand people prove that unicorns don't exist, or that Bigfoot isn't real, or that there isn't a secret city on the dark side of the moon. The burden of proof is always on the one making the claim. If someone says there's an invisible being who created the universe, watches your every move, listens to your thoughts, and will judge you after death, they're the ones making a very big claim. Saying, "I'm not convinced," isn't an equal and opposite claim. It's a pause, and in that pause, something changes. Because when you stop assuming that belief is the default, a lot of the pressure melts away. You don't have to defend an alternative belief. You don't have to prove anything. You're just saying that the question remains open, that you're not going to fill in the answer with something that doesn't hold up. That's what makes atheism different from a belief system. It doesn't start with conclusions, it starts with questions that don't yet have good answers. One reason this gets so misunderstood is because belief is often tied to identity. People grow up being told what to believe before they're taught how to think. Belief becomes part of who they are, part of their culture, their family, their sense of self. So when someone says, "I don't believe that," it can feel to others like an attack on identity. But rejecting a belief doesn't mean rejecting the person who holds it. Not believing in a God doesn't mean you hate people who do. It doesn't mean you think they're stupid or weak. It just means you've looked at the claim, you've considered the evidence, and you're not convinced. And yet, because we've built so much of our society around religious assumptions, atheism often gets treated like it must be hiding a deeper agenda. Like people must be rejecting religion because they want to sin, or because they're angry at God, or because they just want to feel superior. But none of that is necessary to explain it. If someone tells you they don't believe in astrology, you probably don't assume they're angry at the stars or that they're rebelling against horoscopes. You just figure they haven't found any good reason to believe the planets are dictating their personality. It's not emotional, it's not ideological, it's just a judgment call based on what makes sense. Atheism works the same way. The funny thing is, even people who believe in a god tend to be atheistic about every god except their own. A Christian doesn't believe in Zeus or Vishnu or Odin. A Muslim doesn't believe in the Norse pantheon. A Hindu doesn't believe in the Christian Trinity. They're atheists when it comes to every other god. The only difference is that an atheist just goes one god further. That's not a slogan. It's a reminder that everyone draws the line somewhere. The only real disagreement is where that line should be. And here's where the deeper misunderstanding happens. When people think of belief, they often think of it as the source of morality. They assume that without belief, there's no compass, no sense of right or wrong. But morality isn't something handed down from the sky. It's not a download you get from a holy text. In practice, people use their own judgment even when they claim to follow divine rules. Most religious people today don't actually stone adulterers, or execute people for working on the Sabbath, or sell their daughters into slavery, even though those rules are spelled out in Scripture. So what's guiding them then? It's not strict obedience to belief. It's something else. Empathy, conscience, shared values, human connection. Those don't require belief. They require awareness. Atheism doesn't offer a moral system because it doesn't need to. It just clears the space so that morality can be built on something more honest, more flexible, more grounded in actual human needs. And it's not just about ethics either. Atheism doesn't promise answers to life's big questions. It doesn't give you a purpose or a community or a ready-made philosophy. That can feel like a gap at first, especially for people used to being handed those things from birth. But the absence of answers isn't the same as emptiness. It's freedom. Freedom to figure things out for yourself, to question, explore, revise, update. Freedom to admit you don't know, and that not knowing is okay. There's this idea that atheism leaves people cold, that without belief in something higher, life loses meaning. But what if meaning doesn't come from looking up, but from looking around? From relationships, curiosity, creativity, love, learning, building, helping, growing. None of those things require belief in a supernatural power. They just require being awake to life as it is, not as we'd like it to be. And when you stop needing the universe to be built for you, it becomes a lot easier to see it as it actually is. A strange, beautiful, indifferent place, full of chance and chaos and connection, where meaning isn't delivered, it's made. And in that space, atheism isn't a system, it's a clearing where you can choose for yourself what matters, where you're not following a script, but writing your own. There's a kind of discomfort people have with that freedom, the freedom of not knowing. We're conditioned to feel like uncertainty is dangerous, like it's something to be fixed, like if we don't have all the answers, we're lost. But uncertainty isn't a flaw, it's reality. Nobody really knows why we're here, or what happens after death, or whether consciousness is a fluke or a feature. And atheism doesn't pretend to know. That's actually one of its strengths. Because the moment you stop pretending to know, you can start paying attention. You can ask better questions instead of rushing into bad answers. You can wonder about the universe without needing it to be built around you. You can sit with the unknown without wrapping it in mythology. Some people think that makes life bleak, but that only makes sense if you've been taught that life needs a cosmic purpose to be worth anything. It doesn't. It's not meaningless just because there's no invisible author watching over it. If anything, it becomes more meaningful because the moments matter more when you know they're not part of a scripted eternity. You care more about this world when you're not banking on another one. And that's one of the more overlooked effects of letting go of religious belief. It doesn't shrink your sense of wonder, it actually expands it. You stop thinking the stars were put there for you, and start realizing how breathtaking it is that you even get to see them at all. That out of all the ways atoms could have arranged themselves, they arranged into a brain that can think about its own thoughts, that can reflect on its place in a galaxy it will never fully grasp. You don't need a belief system to find awe in that. You just need to stop looking for meaning in stories written before telescopes were invented. There's something humbling about not being the center of the universe. But there's also something freeing about it. You don't have to carry the weight of divine expectation. You don't have to interpret every struggle as a test, or every tragedy as part of a plan. Things can just happen, and that's okay. Some of them will be painful. Some of them will be beautiful. Most of them will be both, but at least they'll be real. That's what atheism allows. Not a tidy worldview, not a neat little box of truths, but a raw, open space where reality can just be what it is, without filters, without myths, without trying to force the universe into a shape it doesn't seem to want to take. And yet, even with all that openness, people still try to recast atheism as some kind of system. They say, well, if you don't believe in God, then science is your religion, or you worship reason instead. Or you've just replaced one faith with another. But that's not how this works. Science isn't something to worship. It's a method. It's a process of testing, revising, questioning, observing. It doesn't claim certainty. It embraces doubt. And reason isn't a belief, it's a tool, a way to navigate the world without relying on wishful thinking. Using evidence isn't the same as having faith in it. Trusting logic isn't the same as believing it can solve everything. These are just ways of avoiding the traps that come with unearned confidence. Nobody's kneeling before a microscope, and even when people do organize around secular values, human rights, freedom of speech, education, democracy, that still doesn't make atheism a belief system. It just means people need frameworks to live together without relying on divine commands. That's where things like secular humanism come in, but again, that's a separate layer. It's not part of atheism itself. It's something some atheists adopt to answer the question, now that I've stopped believing, what do I do with that? Because letting go of belief isn't the end of the story, it's the beginning. It's the part where you stop asking what you're supposed to think and start figuring it out for yourself. One of the most common mistakes people make is thinking atheism has leaders, that there are figureheads or gurus who guide the movement. But there is no pope of atheism, no council of doctrine, no official teachings to follow. Sure, there are public thinkers who've spoken about it, scientists, philosophers, writers, people like Bertrand Russell, Carl Sagan, Richard Dawkins, Daniel Dennett, Ayaan Hirsi Ali, and so on. But agreeing with their critiques of religion doesn't mean subscribing to a shared belief system. You can admire someone's reasoning without treating them like a prophet. You can read their work, disagree with parts of it, question their conclusions, challenge their tone, and still come away with a clearer sense of your own views. That freedom of thought is the whole point. It's not about replacing one doctrine with another. It's about avoiding the trap of treating any voice as sacred. And the moment you start organizing atheism around beliefs, you lose what makes it unique. Because belief systems tend to have a structure. They tell you what's true, what's good, who you are, what to fear, what to worship. They give you the answers first, and then ask you to fit your life into them. But atheism doesn't offer answers like that. It just clears away claims that haven't been supported. That's not the same as replacing them with your own. It's like if someone hands you a map that leads to treasure, but every time you follow it, you end up in a dead end. Eventually, you stop trusting the map. That doesn't mean you now believe there's no treasure anywhere. It just means you're not going to waste your life digging in the wrong places. That's what atheism is. It's not saying there's nothing to find. It's saying this particular map doesn't hold up. And if you've ever spoken openly about not believing, you've probably heard things like, well then what's the point of life? Or what keeps you from just doing whatever you want? As if morality, purpose, and self-control can only exist under supervision. But here's the thing. People still love, care, create, grow, mourn, and celebrate without believing they're being watched by an invisible being. They still help others build communities, stand up for justice, and sacrifice for what matters. Not because they're following rules carved in stone, but because they're human. And if that's not enough, if morality only works when someone's watching, then maybe it was never really morality to begin with. Atheism doesn't give you a list of thou shalts. It doesn't hand you a ready-made framework for every moral dilemma. That can be unsettling, especially if you were raised with rigid answers for everything. But that space, that moral responsibility, it's also where the real work begins. You can't just appeal to a higher power. You have to think, to reason, to feel, to listen, to make hard decisions in a complicated world without assuming there's a reward or punishment waiting at the end. And that might be more demanding than faith ever was. It's easier to follow a path than to build one, but building one, slowly, honestly, gives you a life that's actually yours. That's not a belief system, that's the absence of a borrowed one. One of the more subtle challenges of not believing is how people react to it. It makes some of them uncomfortable. Even if you're not trying to argue or provoke anything, even if you're just being honest, they'll say things like, well, how can you be sure there isn't something out there? Or isn't it arrogant to think humans can understand everything? But not believing in gods doesn't mean you're sure of everything. It doesn't mean you've solved the universe. It just means you're not going to believe in something without enough reason. In fact, most people who don't believe are constantly questioning things. That's the whole point. You don't claim to have all the answers. You just stop pretending to. There's a big difference between I don't know and I believe anyway. And when someone says atheism is a belief system, they're often using it to flatten that difference, to imply that disbelief is just a reverse religion, that it's based on just as much faith, only in the opposite direction. But that's not how this works. It takes no faith to say, I'm not convinced. It doesn't require loyalty or obedience. It doesn't ask for rituals or tithes or sacred texts. It just takes a willingness to stay grounded in reality, even when the answers are incomplete or unsatisfying. Because here's the truth most belief systems avoid: not knowing is okay. You don't need to pretend to know where we came from, or why anything exists at all, or what happens when we die. You can live with those questions open. You can carry them with you like a traveler, instead of trying to stuff them into a suitcase of ancient ideas. That doesn't make you hollow, it makes you honest. And that's something people often overlook, the quiet honesty that comes with saying, I don't know, and I don't believe until I do. That's not a system, that's an approach. A method of staying true to what you actually know instead of what you wish were true. And in that sense, atheism is really just intellectual integrity. It's resisting the urge to insert imaginary answers into the silence. It's refusing to build certainty on sand. Some might call that bleak, but maybe it's just clear-eyed. Because when you stop expecting the universe to revolve around your story, you start noticing other stories, other lives, other minds. You start noticing the fragile, beautiful, improbable reality we all share, one that doesn't need a designer to be astonishing or a master plan to be meaningful. Meaning doesn't need to be given, it can be made, piece by piece, through choices, relationships, curiosity, and care. And none of that requires belief, it just requires attention. It's easy to forget how rare that is. Real attention. Being awake to the world as it is, not as we wish it were. That's something most belief systems discourage in their own way. They replace attention with obedience, replace mystery with mythology, but atheism has no such filter. It's just you, the world, and whatever you make of it. Some people still insist, though, that if atheism leads people to certain values, like reason, skepticism, or science, then it must be a kind of belief system after all. But that confuses correlation with cause. It's not that atheism gives people those values. It's that once you stop relying on supernatural answers, you tend to start relying on better questions. That shift doesn't require belief. It just grows naturally from curiosity, from asking what else might be true if the old answers don't hold up. And the irony is, the same people who accuse atheists of having too much faith in science often live their entire lives depending on it. They trust medicine, engineering, weather forecasts, they fly in planes, text on phones, take antibiotics, all based on systems built without prayer. But somehow when it comes to the origin of life, or the nature of consciousness, or the age of the universe, suddenly they draw the line, as if science is great for making cars, but not for understanding reality. That's not a defensive belief, that's a compartment. And atheism challenges that, not by claiming to know everything, but by refusing to accept the double standard. If we demand evidence in every other area of life, why should this one get a free pass? And yet, asking that question makes some people deeply uncomfortable, because belief isn't just intellectual, it's emotional, social, and cultural. It's tied to family, identity, tradition. And questioning it often feels like a betrayal, not just of the idea itself, but of the people who held it. So it's easier, sometimes even necessary, for believers to frame atheism as just another belief. That way, they don't have to rethink anything. They can say, well, that's just your belief and move on. But reducing disbelief to belief is a kind of deflection. It avoids the real conversation, the one about whether the claim is actually true. Because if someone says, I believe the earth is flat, and you say, I disagree, you're not just expressing a competing belief, you're saying the evidence doesn't support the claim. That's not faith, that's judgment. And the same principle applies here. When someone says, there is a God, and someone else says, I don't believe you, those aren't equal claims. One is making an assertion, the other is asking for proof. And if the proof never comes, withholding belief isn't a belief in itself, it's restraint. A lot of people confuse that restraint with emptiness. They think if you're not filling the space with belief, it must be blank. But it's not blank. It's open. Open to new ideas, new ways of understanding, new ways of living. It's not a void, it's a canvas. And there's something powerful in that, because once you stop believing you already have the answers, you're finally free to start looking. One last thing that's worth saying is that not believing doesn't mean you're against belief entirely. It doesn't mean you think every religious person is wrong about everything, or that they're irrational or deluded. It just means you're not convinced by the central claim. That's it. Plenty of religious people are kind, thoughtful, compassionate. Plenty of them do good in the world. That doesn't make their gods any more real. But it also doesn't mean we need to pretend they're our enemies. This isn't about building a wall between belief and non-belief. It's about being clear on what's actually being claimed and what it takes to accept that claim. And atheism, if we even need to use the word, is simply what happens when you decide that honesty matters more than comfort, that you'd rather live with questions than fake answers, that you don't need cosmic surveillance to know right from wrong, that you can love your life without believing it's been designed, and that you're okay not having a grand narrative, because life is big enough without one. People will keep trying to frame atheism as a system, because that's the framework they're used to. They want everyone to be playing the same game, even if they're on opposite teams. But some of us just walked off the field, off to prove a point, not to win an argument, but because we realized we didn't need the game in the first place. There's no doctrine here, no scripture, no conversion, no mission, just a decision to let go of beliefs that didn't hold up and to live in the world as it is, not as someone once claimed it was. And that's not a belief system. That's the absence of one